The river should have killed her, yeah. Four men on horses, a $300 price on her head, and a locket her dying mother told her never to open. She jumped. And when a rancher pulled her body from the water, his hands began to tremble. Not because of the cold, because he recognized the locket around her neck. He had buried its twin 7 years ago in a grave on the hill behind his house alongside the wife, whose name he could no longer speak. This is her story. She stood alone on the dusty main street of a town she had never seen, holding a letter from a man she had never met. The stagecoach that brought her was already gone, its wheels churning up a trail of brown dust that hung in the autumn air like a question no one wanted to answer. Her single carpet bag lay at her feet where the driver had tossed it without a word or a glance. And the man who had promised to meet her, the man whose letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, was nowhere to be found. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. Beneath the high collar of her navy traveling dress, a silver locket rested warm against her skin. It was the only thing she had left from her mother, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. Her mother's voice came back to her now, faint as a hymn heard through church walls. Do not open this locket, my darling, not until you have found your home. You will know when the time comes. Promise me. Elise Whitmore had promised. She was 12 years old when she made that promise, kneeling beside a bed that smelled of camphor and sorrow, holding the thin, trembling hand of the woman who had given her life. 10 years had passed since that morning. 10 years of keeping the locket closed while curiosity and loneliness pulled at the clasp like invisible fingers. But a promise to a dying mother is not the kind you break. She touched the locket, now pressing it against her collarbone, and told herself that this was not the end. That the emptiness of this street, the silence where a greeting should have been, the slow crawl of dread in her stomach, all of it would make sense once Mr. Voss arrived. He would explain. He would apologize for the delay. He would be the man from the letters. But somewhere deep in the quiet, honest part of her heart, the part that had learned to read danger the way other girls learned to read music, Elise Whitmore already knew. Something was wrong. 3 days earlier, she had been on the stagecoach, watching the world she knew fall away behind her like a coat she would never wear again. Boston was gone. The narrow streets, the gray sky, the attic room where she had slept on a cot so thin she could feel every slat of the floor beneath it. Gone. Her mother, Agnes Whitmore, had died of a consumption when Elise was 12. After that, she was taken in by her Aunt Prudence and Uncle Horace. Not out of love. Not of obligation, the kind that looks like charity from the outside and feels like a cage from within. She cooked their meals, scrubbed their floors, mended their clothes, nursed their 4 children through fevers and tantrums, and in return received a cot in the attic and whatever food was left after everyone else had eaten. She ate standing up in the kitchen, scraping the bottoms of pots with a wooden spoon. She wore their children's outgrown clothes let out at the seams, patched at the elbows. She was fed enough to work, but never enough to feel full, warm enough to survive, but never enough to feel comfortable. Uncle Horace drank. When he drank, he shouted. When he shouted, things broke. Dishes, chairs. Once Elise's wrist through the doctor was told she had fallen on the stairs. She learned to move quietly, to make herself small, to read the level of whiskey in the bottle, the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. She learned that silence was safer than speech, and obedience was safer than hope. For 10 years she endured. She taught herself to read by borrowing discarded newspapers from the parlor. She taught herself to write by copying her uncle's correspondence when the house was asleep. She saved every spare penny from errands, hiding the coins in a sock inside her pillowcase, waiting for the day she would need them. That day came on a Tuesday morning in June, when she opened the Boston Herald and saw the advertisement. Respectable gentleman of means seeks a bride of good character for life in the Montana Territory. Comfortable home, honest living, mutual respect guaranteed. She answered it with trembling hands and the last of her saved coins for postage. The correspondence with Mr. H. Voss lasted 3 months. His letters were articulate, warm, even charming. He described himself as a widower, a businessman with ranch holdings outside a town called Dust Haven. He sent money for her passage, a stagecoach ticket, and $20 for expenses. To Elise, it felt like the first breath of air after years of drowning. On the stagecoach heading west, she shared the compartment with a woman named Mrs. Harriet Boone. She was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered with hands that had clearly spent decades working the land. She was returning to her ranch after visiting relatives in Chicago, and she spoke with the blunt practicality of a woman who had no patience for nonsense. Be careful with those mail-order arrangements, child. Mrs. Boone told her, studying Elise with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Most are honest, men who need wives, women who need homes. But some are not what they seem. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. Elise tucked the advice away like a coin in a pocket, not yet knowing how soon she would need to spend it. The landscape changed as the stagecoach rolled west. The cramped streets of the east gave way to open plains so vast they made Elise dizzy. She had spent her entire life inside walls. Walls of the house, walls of the attic room, walls of expectation and obedience. Now those walls were gone, and in their place was sky, so much sky it seemed impossible. Blue layered upon blue, stretching from horizon to horizon without interruption, without apology. She pressed her face to the stagecoach window and felt something shift inside her chest. The enormity of this land made her problems feel smaller. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was not defined by fear. The coach crossed the Missouri River on a flat-bottomed ferry, the water brown and slow beneath them. It entered the Montana territory, and the landscape changed again. Rolling grassland punctuated by buttes in the distant blue shadows of mountains. The air smelled different here, thinner, cleaner, like water from a deep well. Then came the mountains rising against the horizon like the spine of some sleeping giant, their peaks already dusted with early snow. She had never seen mountains before. Their permanence comforted her. Whatever happened in the world of men, those mountains would remain. When Mrs. Boone disembarked at a way station 30 miles from Dust Haven, she clasped Elise's hands firmly. "Remember what I told you, dear. Trust your instincts." She pressed a small card into Elise's palm, her name and the location of her ranch. "If you ever need help, send word." Then she was gone, and Elise rode the final stretch alone. The town of Dust Haven announced itself through smell before sight. Dust and horse and wild sage. The air was so dry and clear that Elise could see individual motes of dirt floating like gold flecks in the afternoon sun. The main street was packed, earth-flanked by false-fronted buildings of weathered pine. A general store, a saloon called the Copper Strike, its swinging doors spilling rough laughter into the street. A blacksmith's forge where the rhythmic clang of hammer on iron rang out like a slow heartbeat. A small church with a crooked steeple. A squat building that served as both jail and sheriff's office. And men, everywhere men, watching from porches, leaning against hitching posts, standing in doorways. Their eyes followed her as she stepped down from the stagecoach, this small, pale woman in a navy dress that was too clean for this place, too Eastern, too out of place. She waited for Voss. He did not come. A boy from the general store told her that Mr. Voss had sent word he would be along directly and pointed her toward the Dust Haven house, a two-story hotel that smelled of lamp oil and boiled cabbage. She took a room and waited, her anxiety growing with every hour that passed. 12 miles east, deep in the Bitterroot Valley, the world was different. Silas Calloway was the first to wake, as he always was. He sat on the porch of the ranch house in the blue-gray light before dawn, a tin cup of coffee in his calloused hands, watching the valley come alive. The coffee was the kind he brewed every morning in a tin pot on the iron stove. Black as coal, strong enough to stand a spoon and bitter as regret. The smell of it mixed with the wet grass and morning frost and the faint sweetness of pine smoke drifting from the chimney. He was 35 years old, tall enough to fill a doorway broad enough to block one. His dark chestnut hair was streaked with early gray at the temples, and his amber eyes carried a weight that had nothing to do with the physical labor that had hardened his body into something that looked carved from the same stone as the mountains around him. He had the hands of a man who had built things and broken things in equal measure, and the quiet authority of someone who had learned that silence said more than shouting ever could. He watched the cattle move in the early light, hundreds of them drifting across the pasture like slow brown clouds. The Bitterroot River glinted silver in the distance. Closer, the hens clucked in the coop and the fire crackled in the stove inside. He set down his cup on the porch rail and went to work without being told. Habit, instinct, the rhythm of a life built on repetition and necessity. He walked to the barn first, checking on the horses. 24 head, each one known by name and temperament. He ran his hand along the flank of his own horse, a tall bay named Judge, feeling for heat or swelling, checking the hooves for stones or cracks. The barn smelled of hay and leather and the warm, musky scent of animals at rest. Dust motes floated in the thin beams of light that sliced through gaps in the planking. 3 fence posts on the western line had loosened in last night's wind. He fetched his hammer and a handful of nails from the tool shed, knelt beside the first post, and drove the nails with even solid strokes. Each blow sent a clean, dry sound through the morning air. The sound of honest work. The sound of a man who knew how to use his hands. His hand stopped on the second post. This was the one Margaret used to sit on every afternoon reading to him while he worked. The wood was worn smooth where she would rest, the bar arc rubbed away by the fabric of her skirts over countless evenings. He had never replaced it. He repaired it, reinforced it, kept it standing. The same way he kept the memory of her. Margaret Ellis had been a school teacher from St. Louis. Educated, gentle, with a laugh that could fill every room of the house at once. She married Silas when he was 22, when he was still wild and reckless, still riding with his brothers as the Bitterroot Riders, robbing stagecoaches and supply wagons across the territory. She told him that if he wanted her, he had to choose. The outlaw life or her. He chose her without a heartbeat of hesitation. His brothers followed. They bought the Briarstone Ranch with money whose origins they never discussed, and they built an honest life. Margaret made that life possible. She was the compass that kept them pointed toward decency when everything in their blood and their history pulled them toward something darker. 7 years ago, winter fever took her. It took the baby she was carrying too. A daughter, the doctor said afterward. Silas buried them both on the hill behind the ranch house under a cottonwood tree that Margaret had loved because it reminded her of one that grew outside her childhood home in St. Louis. He carved the headstone himself, working 3 days straight in bitter cold, his fingers cracking and bleeding until every letter was perfect. He had not spoken her name aloud since. In the house there was a room, her sewing room, her reading room. He had locked it the day after the funeral and kept the key on a chain around his neck. Everything inside was exactly as she had left it. Books on the shelf, sewing basket on the side table, needle still threaded, a half-written letter on the desk, the pen resting beside it as if she had stepped away for only a moment and intended to come back. His brothers knew not to mention it. Wyatt appeared from the barn carrying a feed bucket. He was 31, the middle brother, leaner than Silas, but still powerfully built with light brown hair that curled slightly at his temples and amber eyes that missed nothing. Wyatt was the thinker, the planner, the one who managed the ranch's finances with the precision of a man who understood that on the frontier, preparation was the difference between survival and ruin. He watched Silas working on the fence and calculated in his head. 3 posts loose, 2 nails each. Enough nails in the shed for maybe 40 more repairs. Need to order from the general store next week. Cole came last, riding in from the eastern pasture at a speed that Silas would call reckless and Wyatt would call suicidal. His horse, a red roan named Hellfire, skidded to a stop in front of the barn and kicked up enough dust to coat Wyatt's trousers. East fence is solid, Cole announced, swinging down from the saddle with the grace of a cat. But I spotted grizzly tracks in the ravine, few days old. Silas looked up from the fence. Keep your guns on you when you ride that stretch. Brother, I always keep my guns on me. Cole patted the twin revolvers on his hips and grinned. Wyatt shook his head. One day that confidence is going to get you killed. But not today, Cole said, and the three brothers divided the morning's work among them without another word. Silas on fences, Wyatt on the herd, Cole on water. The coordination of men who had lived and worked side by side their entire lives, who could read each other's intentions the way most people read printed words. By evening, they sat together on the porch, tin cups of coffee cooling in their hands, watching the valley turn from gold to copper in the fading light. Nobody spoke much, they did not need to. The love between them was expressed through shared labor, through trust, through the unspoken understanding that each would die for the others without hesitation. Back in Dusthaven, Harlan Voss finally arrived. He came to the hotel in the late afternoon, a thin, sharp-featured man of 48 in a black suit that was too fine for a frontier town. His silver-streaked black hair was neatly combed. His gray eyes had the polished quality of riverstone, smooth and cold and impossible to read. He moved with the careful precision of a man who measured every word, every gesture, every silence. At first, the meeting went well. He was polite, attentive. He complimented Elise's appearance, asked about her journey, ordered tea and a hot meal. But her instincts sharpened by 10 years of reading. Uncle Horace's moods began to prickle. Small things. His hands were too clean for a rancher. His questions about her family felt probing rather than curious. Does she have relatives? Would anyone come looking for her? And when she reached for the locket at her throat, his eyes fixed on it with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of her neck. That evening, he took her to his office above the general store. The room was neat and cold. A desk, ledgers, a Locket cabinet. A map of the territory hung on the wall, marked with colored pins in various locations. Each pin, she would later understand, represented a delivery point in a network of cruelty that stretched across the frontier like a spider's web. Voss poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into the chair behind his desk, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. The warmth he had worn like a mask all afternoon fell away, and what remained beneath it was something flat and professional and terrifying. His eyes were no longer polite. They were assessing her the way a cattleman assesses livestock at auction. There had been a change of plans, he said. A business associate, a Mr. Garrett Blackwood, had expressed interest in acquiring a young woman of Elise's description. Voss explained this the way a man might explain the sale of a horse, calmly, without emotion, with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered this speech before. The marriage had never been real. The letters were bait-crafted over years of practice. The money for her passage was an investment. There was no ranch. There was no comfortable home. Elise was merchandise. You should not take this personally, he added, sipping his whiskey. I have arranged similar introductions for many young women. Those who cooperate find their circumstances manageable. Those who resist are still delivered, just in worse condition. I encourage cooperation. She tried to leave. A large, dull-eyed man named Clem blocked the door. He was enormous, thick-necked, with hands the size of shovels, and an expression that suggested independent thought was not among his skills. He did not speak. He simply filled the doorway like a wall of flesh. Elise was locked in a room above the general store for the night. The window was nailed shut. She tried to pry the nails loose with her fingers, tearing her nails until they bled before she stopped. Through the thin wall, she could hear Voss and Clem drinking below, laughing. Casual, relaxed laughter. The laughter of men who had done this so many times it had become routine. She heard the number. $300. That was her price. In the darkest hour of the night, she sat on the edge of the bed, closed her eyes, and thought of her mother. Agnes had survived 10 years with Uncle Horace. She survived by being invisible, by being useful, by never giving them a reason to watch her closely. But Agnes had also left Elise a locket and a promise. Open it when you find home. Not survive. Find home. Her mother had not wanted her to merely endure. She wanted her to live. Lise made her decision. She would escape at the first opportunity. If she failed, she would fight. If she could not fight, she would run. And if she could not run, she would jump into whatever abyss presented itself, because any fate was better than the one Voss had planned. Morning came gray and cold. Clem went outside to adjust the horse's bridle. Voss was in his office counting money. Elise picked up a heavy brass candlestick from the dresser, wrapped it in her shawl, and waited behind the door. When Clem entered to fetch her, she swung with everything she had. The candlestick caught his temple with a sound like a mallet hitting a side of beef. He staggered. He did not fall. He was too big, too thick. But it gave her 2 seconds. She ran. She burst into the early morning street, her traveling dress tangling around her legs, her carpet bag abandoned, her locket bouncing against her chest. Voss appeared behind her, shouting. Clem stumbled out with blood streaming down his face. Within minutes, 4 riders were in pursuit. 4 horses bearing down on one woman on foot. They caught her at the river. Voss cut her off, riding his horse directly into her path at the edge of the embankment. The others fanned out behind her. Below, the Bitterroot River roared brown and violent, swollen with autumn rain. "Do not be foolish, girl," Voss said, dismounting. His voice was flat and final. "The river will kill you." Elise looked at the water. It was chaos. Brown foam crashing against rocks, branches spinning in the current like broken bones. No sane person would jump. She looked at Voss, at Clem, wiping blood from his eye, at the 2 other men whose faces showed nothing. Not pity, not cruelty, just the blank indifference of men who had done this before. She thought of her mother, of the locket against her skin, of a promise made to a dying woman in a room that smelled of camphor and sorrow. She jumped. The cold hit her like a wall of ice. The current seized her instantly, dragging her under with a force that felt alive and malicious. She could not breathe. Water filled her nose, her mouth, her lungs. Rocks struck her sides. Branches clawed at her dress. The fabric became an anchor, pulling her down. She fought for the surface, caught one gasping breath, and was pulled under again. The cold numbed her limbs. Her vision went gray. She was drowning, and the last thing she thought before the darkness took her was that at least she had chosen this herself. When her body finally lodged against a tangle of fallen branches at a bend in the river, where the current slowed, she was no longer conscious. Half in the water, half on the bank, she looked like debris, a bundle of cloth and pale skin caught in the wreckage. Above on the bank, Voss sat on his horse and stared at the churning water. Clem asked if they should ride downstream to look for the body. Voss considered. Then he shook his head. "The river did our work for us. She is dead." But his expression was troubled. Blackwood would not be pleased. $300 lost to the current. Late that afternoon, Cole Calloway was riding along the river, checking the fence line that followed the bank. The autumn light was golden, the air cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. His horse whinnied nervously and pulled at the reins. Cole looked toward the water. He saw a shape tangled in the branches. At first he thought it was Flotsam, a bundle of rags. Then he saw the blonde hair trailing like pale seaweed in the current. The white hand, motionless fingers slightly curled. He was off his horse before he finished thinking. The water was cold enough to make him curse through his teeth. He waded to the tangle and pulled the shape free. A woman, young, small, soaked through and blue-lipped. She was not breathing. He dragged her to the bank, turned her on her side, and pounded her back with the heel of his hand. Water poured from her mouth in a thin stream. She coughed once, a weak rattling sound like wind through a broken shutter. Her eyes opened for 1 second, blue as cornflowers, and closed again. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. Less than a saddle, less than a bale of hay. He laid her across his horse, one hand, keeping her steady, and rode for the ranch house at a gallop, shouting for his brothers before he even cleared the tree line. Silas heard the shouting first. He came off the porch at a run, his long strides eating up the distance between the house and the approaching rider. Wyatt was right behind him, already assessing, already thinking. They saw Cole riding hard with something draped across the saddle, something small and still and pale. Three men carried one woman into the house and laid her by the fire. Silas checked her breathing, her pulse. Wyatt stripped off her soaked outer clothing with the practical efficiency of a man who had done the same for sick cattle, wrapping her in wool blankets. Cole fed the fire until the heat was fierce enough to push back even the memory of that cold river. Then Silas saw the locket. It had slipped free from her collar during the rescue. A small silver oval on a thin chain resting against her collarbone, catching the firelight. The color drained from his face. His hands, which had been steady throughout the entire emergency, began to tremble. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, noticing. "Nothing." Silas stepped back from the woman as if she had burned him. He went to the porch. He stood in the cold evening air, staring at the sky turning dark above the mountains, and he did not come back inside until Wyatt called him for supper. When Elise opened her eyes, it was nearly dawn. The fire crackled. A wool blanket covered her, rough but warm. Her body ached in places she did not know could ache. She turned her head slowly and saw a room. Timber walls, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with provisions, and three men, all of them enormous, all of them watching her. She flinched back in terror. Cole raised his hands, palms out. "Easy now, you are safe." Safe. The word did not sound real. "Where am I?" Silas spoke from the shadows near the wall. His voice was deep and quiet, with the measured pace of a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chose nails. Only what was needed. Nothing wasted. "Briarstone Ranch. My brothers and I pulled you from the river. You have been unconscious since yesterday afternoon." Her memories returned in fragments. Gray eyes, a horse blocking her path, the river swallowing her whole. Her breathing quickened. "They will come for me. The man who brought me here. He will come." The brothers exchanged a look, the wordless communication of men who had spent a lifetime reading each other. Silas nodded once. "You can stay here until you are well enough to decide what comes next," he said. "No one is going to force you to do anything." She looked at him. At his weathered face, his steady amber eyes, the way he held himself like a man who had endured great pain and survived it without bending. Something in his voice made her believe him. She closed her eyes. For the first time in days, perhaps in years, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion fully. And she slept. 3 days later, when she could sit up and speak clearly, they gathered around the kitchen table. 4 tin cups of coffee steaming in the morning light. Outside, the sound of hens clucking and wind moving through grass. Silas spoke first. "Winter is coming. A few weeks, the passes will be snowed shut, and the road to town will be hard to travel. You need a place to stay. We have one." Wyatt added the practical details. "You will have your own room, Silas's room. He will sleep in the barn. We will provide food, shelter, and protection. You owe us nothing." Cole leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "But if you want to help with cooking, that would be appreciated, because Wyatt cooks like he is punishing the food." Wyatt gave Cole a look that could freeze water in July. Elise looked at each of them in turn. "Why you do not know me? Why would you help?" The brothers exchanged another of their silent conversations. Then Silas answered. 7 years ago, my wife died. Before her, we were bad men. She gave us a reason to be better. Since she has been gone, I am not sure we have kept to it." He paused. "Helping you is perhaps how we remind ourselves that we still can." It was the first crack in his armor, small but deep, and it established the arrangement. Not a marriage, not a contract, just an agreement to live under the same roof with clear boundaries and mutual respect until circumstances allowed a different decision. Elise agreed. She would stay. She would contribute by cooking, cleaning, helping with whatever work she could manage. No obligations beyond respect. One more thing, Silas said as everyone stood. There is a room at the end of the hall. It is always locked. Do not ask why may. She nodded. She did not ask. But the curiosity planted itself like a seed in dark soil. The days that followed unfolded in the rhythms of ranch life, and each day taught Elise something new about the land and the men who worked it. Mornings began before dawn. She would rise and brew coffee the way Silas had taught her, grounds boiled in a tin pot on the iron stove strong enough to strip paint. The smell of it filled the house, mixing with the scent of pine smoke from the fireplace and bacon crackling in the skillet. She gathered eggs from the hen house, a task she had volunteered for after watching Cole nearly lose a finger to an aggressive hen named Jezebel. That creature has the devil in her, Cole said, standing outside the coop with his scarred hands on his hips, glaring at Jezebel with the same look he usually reserved for men in saloons just before a brawl. Do not let the innocent clucking fool you. Elise laughed, a small sound unexpected and real, the first time she had laughed since arriving in Montana. Afternoon, Silas taught her how to set fence posts. He showed her how to hold the hammer, how to choose the right wood. Red cedar for posts because it resists rot, pine for rails because it is lighter. His large hands guided her smaller ones on the handle. The warmth of his fingers transmitted through the wood. A moment of contact, brief and unintentional, but both of them felt it. Silas pulled his hand away quickly. Evenings, Wyatt discovered that she could read and write, and he enlisted her help with the ranch's bookkeeping. They sat together at the kitchen table, heads bent over accounts and supply lists. He was surprised by her quickness, her sharp mind for numbers. "You have the makings of a ranch manager?" He told her one night, and the compliment, rare from Wyatt, made her flush with pride. One evening, she accidentally tore a page from the account ledger while turning it. She froze. Her body braced for the blow. Uncle Horace would have struck her for such a mistake. But Wyatt just looked at the torn page, then at her stricken face, and said calmly, "Paper can be mended. People are harder." He took the page, carefully repaired it with a thin strip of paste, and handed it back. No harm done. Tears filled her eyes, not for the paper, for the realization that she had been bracing for violence that would never come. Not here. Not from these men. Cole taught her to ride. Properly, not the side saddle she had vaguely learned in Boston, but astride with her skirts hitched and her hands firm on the reins. When she fell the first time and the second and the third, he did not laugh. He simply helped her up, dusted her shoulders, and said, "The ground is always there to catch you. Problem is it catches hard." He taught her everything about horses, how to read their moods through their ears. Well, the ears forward means attention. One ear turned means they are listening to you. Both ears flat means anger, and that is when you should be somewhere else. How to saddle properly, checking that the horse had not puffed its belly during cinching. How to brush the coat, always with the grain, stiff brush for the body, soft for the face. Horses remember how you treat them, Cole said. Be kind to them, and they will carry you through hellfire and back. Be rough, and they will leave you stranded when you need them most. He introduced her to a gentle mare named Penny Chestnut, colored calm but steady. Elise stroked Penny's muzzle, and the horse breathed warmly into her palm. A strange, simple sensation that made her smile without thinking. She learned frontier cooking. Biscuits on a cast-iron stove, the foundation of every frontier breakfast. Flour, lard, baking powder, a pinch of salt, cold creek water. Knead gently. If you work the dough too hard, biscuits come out like bricks, Martha Hensley told her during one of her visits. If you work it just right, they are light as clouds and melt on the tongue. The first 4 batches Elise made were so hard that Cole used them to level a wobbly table leg. The 5th batch came out golden, fluffy, and steaming, and Silas ate 3 in a row without saying a word. That was the highest praise he was capable of giving. She learned to stew venison. Meat cubed and seasoned with coarse salt and cracked pepper, seared in a cast-iron skillet with rendered lard until the surface was dark and crackling, sealing the juices inside. Then simmered all day in creek water with wild carrots and potatoes and a handful of dried herbs that Martha had taught her to identify in the meadow behind the ranch. Sage for flavor, thyme for warmth. A single bay leaf dried and papery that released its fragrance slowly into the broth like a secret told in whispers. The smell of the stew drifted through the valley each afternoon, rich and deep and promising, and the Calloway brothers could find their way home by scent before they could find it by sight. It was the smell of a house becoming a home again, though none of them would have said so aloud. One evening after supper, the four of them sat around the fireplace while wind rattled the windows. Wyatt brewed a second pot of coffee, the evening kind, darker and thicker than morning coffee. Cole told stories. He was always the storyteller. "That grizzly I saw 2 seasons ago," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "standing up on its hind legs a full head taller than Silas. I drew my gun. It looked at me. I looked at it. We stood there maybe 10 seconds. Then it dropped to all fours, turned its back, and walked away, like it decided I was not worth the trouble." "It was right," Wyatt said dryly, not looking up from his ledger. Cole threw a chestnut at Wyatt, missed. The chestnut sailed past Wyatt's shoulder and landed in Silas's coffee cup. Silas looked down at his cup, then up at Cole and said nothing. Cole shrank in his chair. Elise laughed. The sound escaped before she could catch it, warm and unguarded and bright, filling every corner of the room. The three brothers looked at her, and something shifted in the house that had nothing to do with the wind outside. It was a sound that had been missing from these walls for 7 years. A woman's laughter light in natural, reaching into the places where men's silence could not. Silas watched her laugh, and on his weathered face something moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one warm and fragile like the first light of dawn touching mist. One afternoon, Cole took her to the river. The same river that had nearly killed her. She stood on the bank trembling, unable to step closer. The sound of the water dragged her back to that day. The cold, the darkness, the feeling of being swallowed whole. Cole stood beside him. He did not touch her. He did not push. He simply said, "The river is just water, Elise. It tried to take you, and it failed. You are stronger than it is." They stood there for 20 minutes. Then Elise took one step forward, then another. She knelt at the water's edge and let the current run over her fingers, cold but not violent. Not today. She looked up at Cole, and for the first time since arriving in this valley, she smiled a real full smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and lights up the whole face. Cole smiled back. "There she is," he said quietly. Martha Hensley came every few days, always with something warm to eat and a kind word. She was 28, a widow running her own small homestead 6 miles away, auburn hair perpetually escaping its pins, green eyes sharp with intelligence, calloused hands that could deliver a calf and bake bread on the same afternoon. As Martha changed Elise's bandages one morning, she talked easily, filling the cabin with a warmth that Elise had not felt since her mother died. She did not press for details about Elise's past. She simply talked. About her homestead, her late husband, the beauty and hardship of frontier life. "Silas lost his wife 7 years ago," Martha said quietly when the brothers were out of earshot. "Margaret, she was everything to him. He has been alone, truly alone, even with his brothers beside him ever since. I have never seen him react to a stranger the way he reacts to you." "What do you mean? He is afraid," Martha said simply. "Not of you, of what you remind him of." That night, unable to sleep, Elise walked through the darkened house. She passed the door at the end of the hall, the locked door. She noticed something she had not seen before. Beneath the door, in the gap between the wood and the floor, the edge of a piece of paper. Old paper yellowed with time, the ink faded to brown. She knelt and pulled it free, gently, carefully. A fragment of a letter written in an elegant, feminine hand. "And I think of you every day, my dear sister." If you are reading this, it means I have finally found the courage to send it. I have wanted to tell you for so long where I am, that I am alive, that The letter ended mid-sentence. The rest was behind the locked door. A letter from Margaret to a sister she had lost contact with, a sister she desperately wanted to find. Elise folded the fragment carefully and put it in her pocket. She did not tell the brothers, not yet, but something told her this piece of paper was important, perhaps the most important thing she had found since coming to this valley. She touched the locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the one she was forbidden to open until she found home. For the first time she wondered, was this place, this rough and beautiful valley, this house full of quiet, scarred men, the home her mother had spoken of? Or was that just the exhaustion, talking, just the relief of finding kindness after so much cruelty? She did not know, but she knew this much. She was safe here. She was warm. She was fed. She was treated with a respect she had never known from the people who were supposed to love her. And the man who sat on the porch each morning, drinking coffee from a tin cup, watching the sunrise with eyes that held 7 years of unshed grief, had looked at her locket with a recognition that went deeper than coincidence. Something connected them. She could feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. She did not understand it yet, but she would. The peace of the Bitterroot Valley would not last. It never did, not on the frontier, not in a land where men like Harlan Voss operated in the shadows and men like Garrett Blackwood pulled the strings from behind curtains of respectability. And on the eastern ridge, half a mile from the ranch house, a lean figure with a brass spyglass was watching, counting heads, mapping the property, writing notes in a small leather journal. His name was Rowan Decker. He was 32 years old, quiet, dark-haired, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not so carefully empty. He was the best hired gun in Garrett Blackwood's employ, and he had been sent to find the girl who was supposed to have drowned in the river. She had not drowned. She was alive, sitting on the porch of the Callaway Ranch, wrapped in a wool blanket, drinking coffee from a tin cup. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid. Rowan lowered the spyglass. He mounted his horse. He rode back toward Dust Haven. The report he carried would change everything. 2 weeks passed. The cuts on Elise's hands closed and scarred over. The bruises on her ribs faded from purple to yellow to nothing. She could breathe deeply without wincing, could walk the full length of the property without needing to rest. Her body was healing. But the wounds that lived deeper, the ones carved not by the river, but by years of silence and fear, and hands that should have protected her, those had barely been touched. She still woke most nights gasping, dreaming of brown water and the sound of hooves behind her. She still flinched at sudden noises. She still measured the distance to every door in every room, calculating her escape the way she had learned to do in Uncle Horace's house. What anchored her was the ranch. Briarstone had its own rhythm, steady and reliable as the heartbeat of the land itself. And Silas Calloway, the man who had given her his room and his protection without asking for anything in return, remained the deepest mystery of all. He was kind to her, always kind. But his kindness came wrapped in distance, the way a gift sometimes comes wrapped in too many layers of paper. He ensured she had warm clothing, proper meals, a bed with clean blankets. He answered every question she asked about the ranch, the land, the work with a patience that revealed both deep knowledge and a genuine desire to teach. But he never sat too close. He never held her gaze longer than a few seconds. And when their hands touched by accident, reaching for the same dish at supper or steadying the same fence post in the wind, he pulled away as if her skin carried an electric charge. She did not understand it. Not yet. But the hardest part was not his distance. The hardest part was that she had begun to wish he would close it. One morning she was alone in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits, flour dusting her forearms and the front of her apron. Without thinking, she began to hum. It was a hymn her mother used to sing, an old melody that lived in the body rather than the mind, rising up from some deep place where memory and music share the same root. She did not remember all the words. She hummed through the forgotten parts the way her mother always had, filling in the gaps with a soft, wordless sound that was more feeling than song. She did not know that Silas had stopped in the doorway behind her. He stood there for a full minute. His face wore an expression that none of his brothers had seen in 7 years. Not grief exactly, something closer to the ache of recognition, like hearing your own name spoken by a voice you thought you would never hear again. Margaret used to sing that hymn, the same melody, the same key, even the same habit of humming through the verses she could not remember. She used to sing it while she sewed in the evening, while she kneaded bread in the morning, while she sat on the fence post, reading aloud from her books of poetry. When Elise turned and saw him standing there, Silas cleared his throat and asked about breakfast as though nothing had happened. His voice was steady, his face was composed, but when he took his coffee from the stove, his hands were shaking badly enough that the tin cup rattled against the iron. He carried it to the porch and sat down, and for a long time he did not drink. He just held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his palms, staring at the mountains without seeing them. The hymn echoed inside his chest like a bell struck in a room he had kept locked for 7 years. The storm came that night. It rolled in from the west, a wall of black cloud lit from within by veins of white lightning. The thunder was so deep it vibrated the floorboards and rattled the tin cups on their hooks. Rain hammered the roof with the force of 1,000 fists. Wyatt and Cole had gone to the barn to secure the horses. The animals panicked in storms, and it took 2 men to keep them calm. Inside the house, only Silas and Elise remained. She sat by the fire reading a volume of poetry from Margaret's shelf that Silas had given her silent permission to borrow. He had placed the book on the kitchen table one morning, without a word, and she had understood. A crack of thunder, the loudest yet, split the night. Elise flinched so violently that the book flew from her hands and struck the floor. The sound hurled her backward through time, not to this room but to another, to the sound of a fist hitting a table, to hooves pounding dirt, to the roar of brown water as it dragged her under. She drew her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around herself, and trembled. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Her eyes were open, but she was not seeing the fire or the room or the walls. She was seeing the river. She was seeing Mosom. She was drowning all over again. Silas was across the room mending a saddle strap by lamplight. He saw her reaction and stopped. His hands went still. The needle hovered above the leather. Inside him, the old war began again. The pull between wanting to comfort and needing to keep his distance, between the man he was and the man he had become since the day he sealed that room and swallowed the key. For a long moment, he did not move. Then slowly, as if the decision cost him something he could not afford but was willing to pay, he set down the saddle strap. He crossed the room, he picked up the fallen book and placed it on the table, and he sat down in the chair beside her. Not close enough to touch, just close enough that she could feel him there. Solid, warm, immovable the way the mountains outside the window were immovable. "It is only thunder," he said. His voice was low and steady, the voice of a man talking to a spooked horse, calm and sure, and without fear. "I know," she whispered. "My mind knows, but my body remembers." He was quiet for a while. The fire popped. Rain streamed down the windows. "After Margaret died," he said, and the name came out, rough like a word that had rusted from years without use. "I could not sleep in the bed we had shared, not because of grief, or not only grief. My body remembered her being there, the shape of her beside me, the warmth of her. Every night I would reach for her in my sleep and find nothing but cold sheets, and I would wake up losing her all over again." He paused. The fire crackled. "It took 2 years before I stopped reaching." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, the most personal thing he had said to anyone since the day Margaret was buried on the hill. Elise looked at him, and for the first time the distance between them felt like something that might one day be crossed. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not pretending that everything is fine." The storm passed. They sat together by the dying fire in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood each other's pain without needing to explain it. Two people who had lost something essential and were learning slowly and carefully that the world could still hold warmth. In Dust Haven, the atmosphere was very different. Garrett Blackwood entered Harlan Voss's office without knocking. He did not sit. He stood in the doorway, filling it with his heavy frame, one hand resting on his gold watch chain, his cold blue eyes sweeping the room the way a judge surveys a courtroom before passing sentence. Voss, seated behind his desk, understood immediately that the balance of power in the room had shifted like a scale with a stone dropped on one side. Blackwood spoke quietly, each word placed with the deliberate weight of bricks being laid in a wall that was closing around Voss. He reminded him of their arrangement. 3 years, 12 women delivered, the same careful process each time. Advertisements in Eastern newspapers, letters written with warmth and charm that Voss had perfected through practice. Passage money sent. Reception at the stagecoach, transfer to the network. Every time went smoothly, Blackwood said. Every time until this one. What was different, Harlan? Voss swallowed. She was more difficult than I anticipated. She struck Clem with a candlestick. A girl weighing less than 100 pounds incapacitated your man and escaped on foot. Blackwood let the words hang in the air. I am still deciding whether that reflects more on her or on you. Everyone who dealt with Blackwood understood one thing about him. He did not threaten. He informed. He described what was going to happen in a calm and reasonable voice, and then it happened. That was how a former United States Marshal operated. No theatrics, just the cold certainty of a system that had already made its decision. His network of informants had reported a young woman being cared for at the Callaway Ranch. Blonde hair, blue eyes, early 20s. She matched the description. The Callaway brothers, Blackwood said, and the name left his mouth like something sour. The Bitterroot Riders. They think going straight erased their past, but the past does not disappear. It just lies still and waits. And I am very patient. He ordered Voss to retrieve the woman. If the Callaways resisted, Blackwood would provide men and guns. He sent word to his best hired gun, a man named Rowan Decker. Prepare to move. Elise noticed it on the third night. Cole saddling his horse after dark riding south toward town, slipping back before dawn. When she asked him about it the next morning, he gave her his easy grin and said he was checking fence lines. But she knew that grin. She had seen it on Uncle Horace's face 100 times, the smile men wear when they are hiding something and hoping charm will cover the lie. She did not press the matter that day. She watched instead. She noted the tension in Cole's jaw, the way his hand drifted to his gun belt when he thought no one was looking, the circles beneath his eyes from nights without sleep. On the fourth morning, she found him alone by the water trough and spoke plainly. You were not checking fences, Cole. He looked at her for a long time. Then the grin dropped away like a mask removed, and what remained beneath it was raw and honest and afraid. I have been meeting someone, an old friend, a man who rides for Blackwood. Her blood went cold. You are betraying us. No. The word came sharp and wounded. I am trying to save us. Rowan Decker used to ride with me. Before all this, before the ranch, before Margaret, before any of us tried to be decent men, he and I were brothers, closer than blood. I have been trying to turn him, to bring him to our side. The story of Cole and Rowan Decker was the story of two boys who found family in each other because the world had given them none. They met on the streets of a mining town called Silver Creek, both orphans, both hungry, both old enough to understand that nobody was coming to save them and young enough to believe they could save themselves. They stole food together. They slept under the same bridges. They learned to fight back to back in alleys where the only rule was survival. When the Callaway brothers formed the Bitterroot Riders, Rowan rode beside Cole as naturally as a shadow follows its caster. For 5 years, they robbed stagecoaches and supply wagons across the territory, and through all of it, the bond between Cole and Rowan was the one constant. They covered each other in gunfights. They split their shares equally. They made promises around campfires that only young men make promises about loyalty and brotherhood and never leaving each other behind. Then Margaret came into Silas's life and everything changed. She told Silas to choose, and he chose her. The brothers followed. They bought the ranch. They went straight, and Rowan Decker was left standing alone on the road with no one to follow and nowhere to go. He had no Margaret, no ranch, no reason to believe that the world would reward a man like him for being decent. He had never known decency. He had known only hunger and violence and the cold comfort of a loaded gun. So he stayed in the shadows, hiring himself out to whoever could pay, drifting further from the light with every job until the distance between the man he was and the man he might have been seemed impossible to cross. Now he worked for Blackwood. He had seen things that haunted him. Women delivered to remote camps, conversations conducted in the language of livestock. He had not participated directly in the trafficking, but he had protected the men who did. His hands were stained with proximity, if not with blood. Cole's midnight visits had cracked something open inside him. On the last night they met, Cole told Rowan about Elise, not as a mission, as a person. He described how her own uncle had sold her, how she chose the river rather than submission, how she fell from horses 3 times in one afternoon and climbed back on every time without complaint. She is smaller than any one of us by a head, Cole said in the darkness between the trees. But she has more courage than every outlaw I ever rode beside, including you, including me. Rowan said nothing, but riding back toward Blackwood's camp, he stopped his horse at the river, the same stretch of water where Elise had nearly died. He looked at the current flowing silver beneath the moon and thought that if a girl like that could throw herself into the water and come out alive on the other side, then perhaps it was not too late for a man like him to step out of the dark. He did not decide that night, but the seed had been planted in soil that was more fertile than he knew. Martha Hensley came riding in the next morning at a pace that turned heads. Her horse was lathered and heaving, and Martha herself was flushed with urgency, her auburn hair wild around her face. She brought news, and none of it was good. A United States Marshal named Howard Crane had passed through Dust Haven. Voss had approached him privately with a document, a marriage certificate bearing the names Elise Whitmore and Harlan Voss, signed in what appeared to be Elise's hand. It was a forgery expertly done, but convincing enough to give the law a reason to act. If the document was accepted, the Calloways were harboring another man's wife. On the frontier, that was a crime punishable by hanging. But Martha had brought something else, something worse. She had been asking quiet questions around town for days, the way a frontier woman learns to gather information without attracting the attention of dangerous men. She spoke with the stagecoach driver who had brought Elise to Dust Haven, with the hotel owner who had rented her a room, with the blacksmith who noticed things from his forge that other people missed, and with a widow named Edith Granger who had been carrying a memory for 2 years like a stone in her shoe that she could not shake loose. 2 years ago, another young woman had arrived in Dust Haven, a girl named Sarah. She came the same way Elise had, a mail order advertisement, letters from Voss, money for the journey. She was met at the stagecoach, stopped by Voss himself, smiling, his careful smile carrying his 2 clean hands. And within a week she was gone. No one asked questions. No one searched for her. She simply vanished as if the earth had opened beneath her feet and closed again without leaving a mark. Edith had mentioned it to a neighbor at the time. The neighbor had shrugged. Girls come and go on the frontier, she said. Nothing unusual about a bride who changed her mind. But Edith could not forget the look on that girl's face as Voss led her away from the stagecoach. It was the same look Edith had seen on cattle being led to slaughter, the look of an animal that knows. Elise is not the first, Martha said, her voice tight with a fury she was barely holding in check. Voss has been doing this for years, and Blackwood is behind every bit of it. The silence that followed was the kind that presses down on a room like the weight of stone. Elise sat very still, her hands clasped in her lap, her face the color of old linen. She thought of Sarah, a girl she had never met, a girl whose name she had never heard before this moment, a girl who had answered the same advertisement, read the same kind letters, felt the same desperate hope, and disappeared into the same darkness that had been waiting for Elise. "We have to stop him," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear as a bell struck in cold air. "Not just for me, for all of them." That night after supper, with the dishes cleared and the fire burning low, Elise told the brothers everything. Every detail she had been holding back since the day she woke up on their floor. She told them about the advertisement in the Boston Herald, about 3 months of letters that had felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, about arriving in Dust Haven and waiting for a man who never came on time, about Voss's office above the general store with its desk covered in ledgers and its map on the wall stuck with the colored pins, each one marking a place where a woman's life had ended or been forever changed, about the moment his mask fell away and she understood that she was merchandise, about the number, $300, about the locked room and the nailed window and the sound of casual laughter through thin walls, about the candlestick and the running in the river. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she did not stop. She looked each brother in the eye as she told her story, drawing strength from what she saw there. Cole's jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin, his fist balled on his knees. Wyatt's eyes were narrow and sharp, his mind already calculating options and strategies. And Silas listened with the absolute stillness of a man who recognized the shape of suffering because he had carried his own for 7 years. When she finished, tears ran down her face. The fire crackled in the silence. Wind moaned softly through the eaves. Cole spoke first, his voice tight as a drawn wire. "We ride into town tonight. We put Voss in the ground." "No." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The word fell like an iron bar across a doorway. "That is not how we do things. Not anymore." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Silas is right. We go in shooting and we become the Bitterroot Riders again. We lose the ranch, the cattle, our names. They will call it murder, and they will be right." Silas looked at Elise. His amber eyes held something she had not seen there before. Not pity, something fiercer, something that burned steady and quiet like a banked fire. "You are welcome here as long as you need to be. I do not know what Voss will do next, but I know what we will do. We will protect you. We will find a way to do it within the law, and we will not let that man touch you again." Then he walked to the old chest by the wall and lifted the lid. From inside, he took a small silver locket on a chain. He held it in his palm for a moment, looking down at it with an expression that was both tender and terrible, the face of a man holding a piece of his own heart. "This belonged to my wife," he said softly. He placed the locket in Elise's hands. "She and my daughter died 7 years ago. You survived what they did not. That kind of strength deserves something better than fear." It was the first time his control had cracked, the first time the grief behind his steady eyes had shown itself fully, like water breaking through a dam. Elise felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a blanket. A man who had sealed his heart in a locked room for 7 years was opening a door. Just a crack. Just enough for the light to come through. The next morning, a rider arrived at the ranch with a letter. He did not dismount. He simply handed the envelope to Silas, turned his horse, and left without a word. The letter was written in formal legal language. It bore the signature of Garrett Blackwood and demanded the return of one Elise Whitmore Voss to her lawful husband within 72 hours. Failure to comply would be considered criminal harboring and would be met with appropriate force up to and including the involvement of territorial law enforcement. Silas read the letter aloud. The four of them sat in the main room, and the weight of the threat pressed down on them like the ceiling was slowly descending. Elise stood. I will go. I will not let you lose everything because of me. Three voices answered at once, coal sharp and immediate. Like hell you will. Wyatt measured and firm. That is not a decision you get to make alone. And Silas quietest of all, but steadiest. This is your home now. We do not surrender our own. The word home struck Elise like the tone of a bell. She reached for the locket at her throat, the one her mother had told her not to open until she found where she belonged. Her fingers trembled on the clasp, but she did not open it. Not yet. Not quite yet. The next 48 hours were consumed by preparation. The ranch transformed from a working homestead into a fortress, and every task was performed with the careful, deliberate efficiency of men who understood that a single shortcut could cost them their lives. Silas handled the physical fortification. He boarded the windows with 2-inch planks of red cedar cutting, narrow firing slits into each one with a handsaw, measuring twice to ensure a rifle barrel would pass through cleanly without catching. He reinforced the front and back doors with cross braces made from the same cedar, nailing them at angles that would distribute the force of a battering ram across the entire frame rather than concentrating it at the lock. He stacked sandbags along the front wall waist-high using grain sacks filled with dirt from the garden. 50 pounds each packed tight, laid in overlapping rows the way a mason lays bricks, so there are no gaps for a bullet to find. The work was physical and relentless, and Silas did it with the focused intensity of a man performing a task he hoped he would never need, but knew he probably would. The sound of his hammer filled the valley all day, steady and rhythmic, each blow driving a nail deeper into wood that might soon be the only thing standing between his family and the men who wanted to take one of them away. Wyatt handled strategy and logistics. He counted ammunition with the precision of a man who understood that on the frontier a bullet was worth more than $1 because $1 could not save your life. 36 rounds for the Winchester rifles, 48 for the Colt revolvers, 12 shells for the double-barrel shotgun. He drew a detailed map of the ranch on a piece of butcher paper, marking every window, every door, every blind spot where an attacker could approach unseen. He calculated fields of fire, overlapping angles, and retreat routes. He placed water barrels inside the house in case of fire. He inventoried food supplies and medical supplies with equal care. Cole made one final midnight ride to meet Rowan Decker, the most urgent meeting yet. He told Rowan exactly what was coming, the number of men, the timing, the plan. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Will you fight for Blackwood, or will you fight for what is right? Rowan was silent for a long time. The horses stood close together in the dark breath, mingling in the cold air. I do not know if I am a good man, Cole. It has been a very long time since I tried. Then start now. Rowan did not commit. He rode away into the darkness, and Cole returned to the ranch, not knowing whether he had gained an ally or handed his enemies a map of his defenses. That afternoon, Silas taught Elise to load and fire a Winchester rifle. They stood behind the house, the valley stretching golden before them, the target, a fence post 60 yards away. His large hands guided her smaller ones on the weapon. How to seat the stock against her shoulder. How to align the sights. How to control her breathing. Hold your breath. Squeeze the trigger, do not pull it. Let the recoil come naturally. She fired, missed. The shot kicked up dirt 10 feet to the left of the post. She worked the lever, chambered a fresh round, and fired again. Closer, 5 feet to the right. Again. The bullet struck the top of the post, sending a spray of wood splinters into the air. Good, Silas said. I hope I never need to use this, Elise said quietly. Hope is not a plan, Silas replied. Elise looked at him. Those are your words. You said them to me the first week I was here. Something moved behind his amber eyes, not quite a smile, but close, closer than anything she had seen from him before. You listen, he said. That is good. The attack came on the second night, 12 hours before the 72-hour deadline expired. Blackwood did not believe in waiting. 8 riders descended on Briarstone under a moonless sky. They came from three directions. Two groups of three from the east and west. Two riders from the south cutting off the road to town. Their plan was blunt and brutal. Surround the house, set fire to the barn to draw the defenders out, take the woman in the chaos. The barn caught first. A lit torch trailing smoke and sparks arc through the darkness and crash through the hayloft window. Dry hay caught instantly. Within seconds, the inside of the barn was an inferno orange light erupting through every gap in the planking, the horses inside screaming in terror. Cole ran for the barn without hesitation. The horses were more than livestock. They were survival. Without them, the ranch was stranded. Silas and Wyatt took their positions inside the house. Silas at the upper window, where he had the best sight line across the yard and the pasture beyond. Wyatt at the front door, sheltered behind the heavy timber frame with a rifle and a shotgun, and the calm focus of a man who had done his calculations and was ready to spend every round wisely. Elise crouched behind the overturned kitchen table, the Winchester Silas had given her, gripped in hands that were white at the knuckles. Her heart hammered so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The smell of gun smoke and burning hay drifted through the boarded windows. Outside, the night had come alive with violence. Silas fired from above. One shot every 8 seconds, measured, precise. Each round placed within inches of an attacker's position. He was not shooting to kill. Not yet. He was sending a message. This house is defended. The men inside know what they are doing. Come closer if you dare. The first wave came from the east. 3 men tried to use the terrain, crawling through tall grass toward the side of the house. Silas spotted the movement by the way the grass parted in places where the wind was not blowing. He fired 2 rounds into the dirt ahead of them, close enough to spray their faces with gravel. They scrambled backward, dragging one man who had caught a splinter of rock in his cheek. Wyatt held the front. 2 of Blackwood's men had taken cover behind the water trough and were pouring fire at the door. Bullets chewed splinters from the frame, each impact sending a sharp crack through the house that sounded like the building itself was breaking apart. Wyatt waited. He counted shots. He listened for the pause between volleys that meant a man was reloading. When the pause came, he leaned out sighted and fired once. The man behind the trough cried out and fell back. His companion dragged him into the shadows. The big man Clem made his charge 20 minutes into the fight. He came straight at the front door carrying a fence post like a battering ram running with the lumbering speed of a bull. Silas put a round through the fence post itself, exploding the wood into splinters that peppered Clem's face. Cole, fighting his way out of the burning barn, fired from the side. The bullet caught Clem in the thigh. The big man went down 10 feet from the door, roaring like a wounded bear, his hands clutching his leg. "Stay down, Clem," Cole shouted from behind the corral fence. "Next one goes higher." In the barn, Cole fought through walls of smoke and heat. He slashed the ropes, holding the horses, driving them toward the open doors with shouts and slaps. The animals surged past him in a thunder of hooves and terrified eyes. One of Blackwood's men rushed him from behind. Cole spun, drew and fired in a single motion, the instinct of a gunfighter that 10 years of honest living had never fully erased. The man fell, but a second gunman fired from the barn door. The bullet struck Cole in the left side below the ribs. He staggered. The pain was a white-hot spike driven through his body. He gritted his teeth until they creaked, raised his revolver, and returned fire. The second man went down. Cole stumbled out of the burning barn, one hand pressed against the wound, blood soaking through his shirt and darkening his fingers. Horses thundered past him into the night. He made it as far as the corral fence before his legs buckled and he collapsed against the rails. Inside the house, a crash came from the back. One of Blackwood's men had broken through the rear door. Elise heard the splintering wood and turned to see a large shape moving through the smoke that had begun to fill the hallway. He was coming toward her. She raised the rifle. Her hand shook. The shape grew larger. She fired. The bullet buried itself in the wall 6 inches from the man's head. He ducked, cursing. She worked the lever, chambered another round, forced her hand steady, and fired again. The second shot grazed his shoulder. He stumbled backward and retreated through the broken door into the darkness. The raid lasted an hour. When it ended, the barn was destroyed, a skeleton of black timbers glowing against the night sky. The yard was littered with spent brass and dark stains. Two of Blackwood's men lay dead in the dirt. The rest had vanished into the darkness. But Cole was wounded. The bullet had passed through his side, cracking a rib and nicking something that bled badly. Wyatt cut away his brother's shirt and pressed folded cloth against the wound, while Elise boiled water and tore clean fabric into strips. She had never done this before. Her training was biscuits and bookkeeping and fence posts. But her hands were steady. The fear that had paralyzed her for most of her life had been replaced by something harder and more useful. Purpose, Cole, pale and sweating, managed his grin even through the pain. "Heard you shot at someone." "Missed," Elise said, her voice tight. "You did not run. That is what matters." In the gray hours before dawn, while Cole slept fitfully on his cot, Elise dozed in the chair beside him. Her locket slipped free from her collar, the silver chain pulling on her collarbone. Wyatt noticed it. He reached over gently, carefully not to wake her, and turned the locket over in his fingers. On the back, worn but legible, he found an inscription. He carried it to the porch where Silas stood alone, staring at the smoldering ruins of the barn as the first gray light touched the skinny. "Have you looked at the back of her locket?" Wyatt asked quietly. Silas did not answer. "Silas, the engraving reads, 'For my beloved sister.' I have seen that handwriting before. It is in Margaret's letters." Silas closed his eyes. His hands gripped the porch railing until the wood creaked and his knuckles went white as bone. "I know," he whispered. "I have known since the night Cole pulled her from the river." "Then why have you said nothing?" "Because I am afraid of what it means." His voice was raw, stripped of every layer of control he had built over 7 years. "If she is who I think she is, then Margaret died without knowing her own sister was still alive. And I buried my wife without ever reading the letters she was trying to send." The two brothers looked at each other. The implications were enormous. They filled the space between them like floodwater, rising. "The locked room," Wyatt said. "The letter on the desk." Silas nodded slowly. "It is time to open that door." But before they could move, the sound of hoof beats reached them from the road. Multiple riders approaching from the south. The brothers reached for their weapons. The riders were not Blackwood's men. It was Sheriff Ephraim Beckett, with 2 deputies summoned by Martha Hensley's desperate ride to town in the middle of the night. Beckett was 50 years old, with gray hair and the tired eyes of a man who had spent decades walking the narrowest possible line between justice and survival. But Beckett did not come only with help. He came with a problem. In his saddlebag, he carried the marriage certificate that Voss had provided through Marshal Crane. The document bore Elise's name, and Voss's joined in what appeared to be a legal union, complete with what appeared to be her signature. Beckett examined the damaged ranch, the burned barn, the bullet holes, the wounded man on the cot inside. He listened to the Calloway's account of the attack. His expression darkened with every detail. Then he turned to Elise. "I need to hear your side of this, miss." Elise stepped forward. She rolled up her sleeves and showed the fading scars on her hands from the river. She told the sheriff her story clearly and without hesitation, looking him in the eye the entire time. She had told this story once before to the brothers, and it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. Telling it the second time was easier. Not because the pain was less, but because she was stronger. "That signature is a forgery," she said. "I have never signed any marriage document. I was brought here under false pretenses by a man who trades in human beings." Beckett studied her face for a long time. He was not an unsympathetic man. He had seen enough cruelty on the frontier to recognize the truth when it stood in front of him with scarred hands and steady eyes. But he was a man of the law, and the law required more than conviction. It required evidence. A signed document was a signed document until a judge examined it and declared it otherwise. He could not remove a lease from the ranch by force. There was no warrant for that, but neither could he prevent Voss from pursuing his claim through the territorial courts. A hearing will be scheduled in Helena, Beckett said. 2 weeks from now, a judge will examine the certificate and hear testimony from both sides. Until then, Miss Whitmore remains here under the protection of the Calloway family. He paused, looking at the burned skeleton of the barn, the bullet holes stitched across the front of the house, the blood stain on the dirt where Clem had fallen. I will leave 2 deputies here, he added quietly, for what little good it will do. But I want you to understand something, Calloway. He looked directly at Silas. If Blackwood comes again, and I believe he will, the law may not arrive in time to help you. You need to be ready for that. Silas met his gaze. We have been ready since before you got here, Sheriff. Beckett held the look for a moment, then nodded once and mounted his horse. The deputies took positions near the house. The sheriff and his remaining men rode south toward Dust Haven, trailing dust behind them, like a banner of uncertain hope. 2 weeks. It sounded like forever. It would not be enough. After the sheriff left, Silas stood on the porch for a long time watching the dust settle on the road. The valley was quiet now, the way a landscape is quiet after violence has passed through it, the silence not peaceful but exhausted. Smoke still rose from the barn's remains, thin gray threads climbing toward a sky that did not care. Around his neck on a chain he had worn every day for 7 years hung a single iron key, the key to Margaret's room, the room that held her books, her sewing basket, her shawl draped over the back of a rocking chair. And on the desk unfinished, the ink dry for 7 years, a letter she had been writing to a sister she had lost. A letter that might hold the answer to everything, who Elise truly was, what Margaret had been trying to say before the fever took her voice and then her life, and why of all the rivers in all the vast territory the current had carried this particular woman to this particular valley, to this particular house, to a man who had been locking doors and locking hearts for 7 long and lonely years. Silas reached for the key. His fingers closed around the cold iron. It was warm from his skin, but cold in his hand the way grief is warm inside you, but cold whenever you try to hold it. He turned toward the hallway, toward the locked door, and the truth waiting behind it. 7 years of silence were about to end. But Silas Calloway had learned long ago that the frontier does not wait for a man to be ready. And somewhere beyond the valley, Garrett Blackwood was gathering his forces for one final ride. The next time those hoofbeats came, there would be no warning. There would be no mercy, and the locked door would either be opened in peace or never opened at all. Silas took the iron key from the chain around his neck. He had worn it every day for 7 years, the metal warmed by his skin, smoothed by the constant press of his fingers during moments when grief rose up and he needed something solid to hold. The key to Margaret's room. The door he had sealed the day after the funeral and never opened since. His brother stood behind him. Elise waited in the hallway, uncertain, until Silas looked back at her and nodded. You should see this. The door swung open with a sound like a held breath finally released. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it. A rocking chair beside the window angled to catch the afternoon light. A patchwork quilt folded over the back, its colors faded, but its stitching still precise. A sewing basket on the side table needle threaded with blue cotton, waiting for hands that would never return. Books on the shelf, poetry, a farmer's almanac, a Bible with a cracked spine and pages worn soft from use, and on the writing desk a letter, half finished, the ink dry for 7 years, the pen resting beside the paper, as if the writer had stepped away for only a moment and fully intended to come back. The room smelled of old paper and pine wood and the faint mustiness of air that had been sealed too long. It smelled of time stopped, of a life preserved in amber. Before Silas could reach for the letter, Elise stepped forward. She reached into her pocket and produced a small yellowed fragment of paper. "I found this weeks ago," she whispered. "Under the door. I did not know what it meant then, but I think it belongs with this." She placed the fragment on the desk beside the full letter, and the torn edges matched perfectly, two halves of the same page reunited after 7 years. Silas picked up the complete letter. His hand shook so badly the paper trembled like a leaf in wind. He began to read aloud, and his voice, the voice that had commanded men and calmed horses and spoken with iron authority through gunfights and storms, cracked on the very first word. "My dearest Agnes, I have begun this letter 100 times and never found the courage to finish it. I left home so suddenly, and I know you must believe I abandoned you. The truth is that I married a man, a good man, the best I have ever known, and I followed him west. I was afraid that if I wrote, Father would find me, and I could not bear to bring his cruelty into this new life. But I think of you every day, my sweet little sister. You would love this valley. The mountains touch the sky and the river sings at night. I have a home here and a family. 3 brothers-in-law who are rough as uncut timber, but kind beneath it all. And I have a husband who looks at me as though I am the only star in the sky. I want you to know where I am. I want you to come if you are willing. There is room here and love enough for both of us. I am enclosing a locket, our mother's locket, the one she divided between us before she died. Mine bears the engraving for my beloved sister Clara, our mother's name, a reminder that we are bound by blood no matter the distance. If you are reading this, it means I have finally found the courage to send it. I have wanted to tell you for so long where I am, that I am alive, that I... The letter ended there, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Margaret Calloway had never finished it. The fever came before the words could. She died with the letter on her desk and the truth locked in a room that her husband would seal for 7 years. Silas's voice broke on the last word. The room was silent except for the wind pressing against the window glass and the distant sound of the river in the valley below. Elise stood frozen in the doorway. Tears ran down her face in steady, silent streams. Her hand went to the locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the one Agnes Whitmore had worn every day of her life through poverty and cruelty, and the slow decline of consumption, never once opening, it never once explaining what it held. The matching pair to the one Margaret had kept in this room. "Agnes was my mother," Elise whispered. "Agnes Whitmore. She was your wife's sister." Silas looked at her. His amber eyes were bright with tears he had not shed in 7 years. Margaret spoke of her sister constantly. She called her my little Agnes. She said Agnes had a daughter, a baby girl she had never met. That was me. The silence that followed was enormous. It filled the room, the house, the valley. It pressed against the walls like floodwater. Wyatt spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. "Then you are our family, Margaret's niece, our niece by marriage." From the next room, Cole's voice carried through the wall, weak from his wound, but steady with conviction. "I knew it. I knew from the moment I pulled her from the river that she belonged here." Silas crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled Elise into his arms. It was the first time he had reached for her. The first time in 7 years he had reached for anyone. She felt his arms close around her, strong and trembling, and she understood at last why he had been afraid, why he had kept his distance. She reminded him of everything he had lost, and she was living proof that not everything was gone. Elise opened the locket. Her mother's last instruction echoed in her mind. "Do not open this locket until you have found your home." She had found it. Inside was a small photograph faded to sepia of 2 young women standing side by side in matching dresses. They looked almost identical. The same fair hair, the same delicate features. One slightly taller, slightly older, both smiling. "Margaret and Agnes," Silas said softly. "Sisters." Elise closed the locket and pressed it to her heart. The promise was kept, but there was no time for the moment to settle. Even as the truth filled the room like morning light, the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the north. Many hoofbeats, coming fast. Blackwood had assembled his full force, 10 riders, armed and mounted. Among them Clem bandaged and limping, but still standing. Several experienced gunmen from Blackwood's network. And Rowan Decker positioned on the eastern flank, his face carefully blank, his hands steady on his reins. They rode toward Briarstone at dawn, a column of dust and purpose stretching behind them across the valley. Silas moved to the upper window. Wyatt took the front door. Cole, despite the wound in his side that seeped pink through his bandages, pulled himself to the side window, his right hand steady on his revolver. Elise took her position at the kitchen window, the Winchester across her knees. The 10 riders spread into a wide line across the pasture. The cattle scattered running south in a panic, hooves drumming the earth. The air went still, the kind of stillness that comes before violence, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Blackwood rode at the center, dark coat, double-barrel shotgun across his saddle. He was not hiding behind his men. He had come to finish this himself. The battle began differently this time. No probing fire, no testing. Blackwood's men came hard and fast from 3 directions at once, confident in their numbers, certain that the damaged ranch and its wounded defenders could not hold. They were wrong. Silas had repositioned since the first raid, moving from the upper window to a firing slit he had cut in the east wall, giving him a wider angle on the approaching riders. His first shot took the hat off the lead man at 90 yards. His second struck the saddle horn of the rider beside him, sending sparks and leather flying. Neither shot was meant to kill. They were meant to say something far more important. We survived the first time. We are stronger now. The first real assault came from the east. 3 men crawling through the tall grass toward the house, using the terrain for cover. Wyatt, the sharpest observer of the 3 brothers, noticed shadows moving where no shadow should be. He repositioned to the side window, calculated the angle, and fired twice. The first round kicked up dirt in front of the lead man. The second grazed a shoulder. They retreated in disorder. The second assault came from the west. 4 men attempting to flank through the dry creek bed behind the house. Elise saw movement through the kitchen window. She raised the rifle, breathed out the way Silas had taught her, and fired. The shot struck a fence post 2 feet from the lead man's head, close enough to spray splinters into his face. He dove flat and crawled away. She had not hit him, but she had stopped him. Clem made his charge. Limping from his wounded leg, but driven by something beyond reason, he came straight at the front door carrying a fence post like a battering ram. Silas put a round through the post itself, exploding the wood into splinters that peppered Clem's face and chest. Cole, fighting through the pain in his side, fired from the side window and hit Clem in the other thigh. The big man went down 8 feet from the door, roaring in the dirt, both legs useless beneath him. "Stay down," Cole called out, his voice tight with pain. "I am running out of your legs to shoot." The fourth wave came simultaneously from 3 directions, an attempt to overwhelm the defenders with sheer volume of fire. Bullets struck the house from every angle. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams. Inside, the air was thick with gunpowder smoke, the acrid smell of sulfur burning eyes and coating throats. Wyatt counted rounds in his head, 17 Winchester cartridges remaining. 22 Colt rounds, 4 shotgun shells. One more assault like this, and they would be fighting with empty guns. The sun climbed, shadows shortened. The valley rang with echoes of gunfire, and in the pauses between volleys, the silence was worse than the noise. Then Blackwood played his final card. His voice carried across the yard, calm, and measured the voice of a man accustomed to issuing verdicts. "I know about the warrants, Calloway, the Bitterroot Riders, stagecoach robbery 1863. Those warrants are still active. Surrender the woman and I right away. Resist, and when the federal marshals arrive, I hand them proof that you are wanted men. Your ranch, your cattle, your name, all of it gone. Is one woman worth that?" Inside the house, silence fell. The words struck harder than bullets. Elise moved to Silas's side. "Do not do this. Do not sacrifice what you have built. I will go with him." No. Silas's voice was iron-forged and cooled and unbreakable. We rode as outlaws because we had nothing to lose. Now we have something worth keeping. We fight for it. A single gunshot cracked through the morning air, not from the house, not from Blackwood's line, from behind Blackwood's men. Rowan Decker, positioned on the eastern flank, turned his weapon on his own side. His first shot disarmed the gunmen beside him. His second put a bullet in the dirt at the feet of Blackwood's horse, sending the animal rearing. "That is enough!" Rowan's voice cut through the smoke and chaos like a blade through cloth. "I am done, Blackwood. I am done riding for men who sell women like livestock." The effect was immediate. Two hired guns, seeing the best shooter on the field, switched sides, disengaged, and rode away without looking back. They had been paid for a job, not a war. Three more followed within minutes, their horses kicking up dust as they fled south toward the open plains. Blackwood was left with Clem wounded and crawling in the dirt, two loyal men in his own fury. He made the decision that men like him always make when cornered. He charged. He spurred his horse toward the house, dismounted at a run, kicked the damaged front door open, and entered with his revolver drawn. He moved through the main room, sweeping his weapon from side to side, his boots crunching on broken glass and spent cartridges. Silas met him in the hallway, 10 feet apart, the rancher and the fallen lawman. Two men who had both worn masks for years, one of decency over darkness, the other of darkness over something that might once have been decent. "You should have kept your badge," Silas said. "And you should have stayed an outlaw," Blackwood replied. Elise appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Blackwood, her rifle leveled at his back. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. "Drop your weapon." Rowan Decker stepped through the front door, his revolver trained on Blackwood from the third direction. "It is over, Garrett. It was over the moment you decided women were property." Three guns, three directions, no way out. From outside, the sound of many horses. Martha Hensley's voice rang across the yard, clear as a church bell. "Sheriff is here. He brought everyone." Sheriff Ephraim Beckett rode into the valley with 6 deputies, guns drawn, dust billowing behind them like the wake of a ship. Blackwood's remaining men threw down their weapons. Clem raised his hands from where he lay in the dirt, blood soaking through his bandages. Blackwood lowered his revolver slowly. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the expression of a man watching his empire collapse one stone at a time. "Garrett Blackwood," Beckett said, his voice carrying the weight of law and finality, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, trafficking, assault, and murder. Federal marshals will have additional charges when they arrive. For now, you belong to me." In the days that followed, the full scope of Blackwood's operation was revealed. When Beckett's deputies searched Voss's office, they found a hidden compartment in the desk containing a bundle of documents. Among them was a formal letter bearing the seal of the United States Marshal Service, dated 8 years prior. A notice of dismissal for one Garrett R. Blackwood, deputy, United States Marshal District of Montana Territory, for conduct unbecoming abuse of authority and misappropriation of federal funds. Blackwood was not merely a corrupt rancher. He was a former lawman who had used his knowledge of the legal system to build a criminal empire. His trafficking network had operated under the guise of legitimate business for years, protected by his understanding of how evidence was collected, how warrants were served, and how witnesses could be silenced. Voss confessed everything under pressure. Names, dates, locations. 12 women were accounted for. 3 were found alive at a remote camp near the Canadian border, gaunt and frightened but breathing. Others were confirmed dead. Federal marshals arrived from Helena and took custody of both men. Martha Hensley organized the community to help the survivors. Homes were opened. Food and clothing were provided. The church in Dust Haven became a temporary shelter. Elise visited the rescued women. She sat with them on the floor of the church, not speaking, just present. She understood their silence. She understood the way their eyes swept every door and window, measuring distances, calculating escapes. She had been where they were. A young Irish woman named Bridget could not stop weeping. Elise sat beside her, took her hand, and said the only words that mattered. "You are safe now." I know those words do not feel real yet. They did not feel real to me either for a long time. But they are true, and one day you will believe them. The old warrants against the Calloway brothers were resolved through a combination of Martha's advocacy, Beckett's testimony, and the intervention of the territorial governor. A formal pardon arrived by courier on a Tuesday afternoon. One sheet of paper with an official seal that erased a decade of fear. Wyatt read it aloud at the kitchen table, his voice carefully controlled, but his hands trembling on the paper. Cole let out a shout and lifted Elise off her feet, spinning her in a circle despite the pain in his healing side. Even Silas allowed himself a smile. Small, private, but real. That evening, the three brothers sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and for the first time in 11 years, they were truly free men. "Do you remember the last job?" Cole asked. "The stagecoach outside Bozeman." Wyatt nodded. "The one where the wheel broke and we had to help the driver fix it before we could rob him." "He thanked us," Cole said, shaking his head. "The man we were robbing thanked us for fixing his wheel." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and the name he said was one he had not spoken aloud in 7 years. "Margaret always said that proved we were not truly bad men, just lost ones." His brothers did not comment on the name. They did not need to. They sat together and watched the light fade, three men who had ridden through darkness and come out on the other side. A few nights later, the most important scene in the entire story took place. The house was quiet. Wyatt and Cole had gone to bed. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting orange light across the kitchen, where Elise sat mending a shirt torn during the battle. Silas came in from the porch, bringing the smell of cold night air and pine with him. He sat down in the chair across from her. For a long time, neither spoke, only the sound of fire and the soft pull of needle through cloth. Then Silas said in a voice so low she had to lean forward to hear, "I did not save you out of duty." Elise stopped sewing. She looked up. "I told myself that was the reason, that it was the right thing to do, that Margaret would have wanted it, but that was not the truth." He paused. His large hands were clasped on the table, the knuckles white. "When Cole brought you into this house that night, soaked and half dead, I looked at you and I saw someone new, not Margaret. I want to be clear about that. I did not mistake you for her. I saw someone who frightened me because for the first time in 7 years, I felt something besides grief." Silence. The fire popped. "I do not know if I am capable of love again," he said, and the word love fell from his mouth, heavy as a stone dropped into deep water. "I do not know if this heart has that left in it, but I know that when you are here, this house feels like a home again, and I do not want to lose that." Elise set down her needle. She looked at him. At this man, 12 years older than her, weathered by loss, buried under 7 years of silence. And she saw the truest courage she had ever witnessed. Not the courage of gunfire or siege. The courage of opening your mouth to speak the truth when the truth might destroy you. "I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am staying because everywhere else is nowhere without this place." Something inside Silas, a wall he had built brick by brick over 7 years. Mortar mixed with grief cracked. Not collapsed, but light came through. He stood. He walked around the table. He took her hand for the first time by his own choice. Large, calloused, warm. Her small hand disappeared inside his. She pressed her forehead against his chest. His arms closed around her. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything between them had changed. But new happiness is fragile, and the world does not stop testing it simply because you have suffered enough. In the process of cataloging Voss's seized belongings, Sheriff Beckett found a letter that stopped him cold. It was from Horace Whitmore of Boston, dated 4 months earlier. It did not ask about Elise. It asked about Price. Horace knew Voss. Horace had sent Elise to Voss deliberately, not because she answered an advertisement, but because of a private arrangement between them. Uncle Horace had sold his niece to Harlan Voss for $50. When Elise learned the truth, she did not scream. She did not weep. She simply went silent. She stopped speaking. She sat on the porch and stared at the valley with eyes that saw nothing. The connection she had felt with Silas the night before seemed to belong to a different person, a person who had believed she was free when she was never free at all. The brave choice she thought she had made, answering the advertisement, boarding the stagecoach, traveling west, had been a performance staged by the very man who was supposed to protect her. Silas gave her space. 1 day, 2 days. On the third day, he sat down beside her on the porch without speaking. He brought 2 cups of coffee. Hers was made the way she liked it. Black, no sugar, a small detail. But it meant he had been paying attention all along. After a long silence, Elise spoke. Her voice was flat. My whole life I thought I was making my own choices. Leaving Boston, boarding the stagecoach, riding west, I thought that was courage. It turns out it was someone else's script. Silas was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You jumped into the river." "What? You jumped into the river. Nobody told you to do that. Nobody wrote a script for it. 4 men on horses had you surrounded, and you chose the water over surrender. That was your choice. Yours alone." So he paused. "And every day since then, staying here, standing up to fight, opening your heart to strangers. Horace did not write those choices. Voss did not. Nobody did but you." Elise looked at him, tears came. The kind that washed clean instead of the kind that drowned. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He set down his coffee cup and put his arm around her. The darkness retreated, not completely. Some shadows never leave entirely, but enough light came through to see by. Rowan Decker stayed a week after the battle helping with repairs. He mended fences with the careful precision of a man who was building something for the first time instead of tearing it apart. One evening, he and Cole sat on the corral fence, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. "Could you stay?" Cole asked. "We could use another hand." Rowan shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I have things to answer for, and running from them will not make me the man I want to be." The morning he left, he found Elise on the porch. He reached into his coat and produced a thin gold ring, worn smooth with age. "Found this in Voss's belongings. I believe it was your mother's. A wedding ring." Inside the band, barely legible in engraving, a E and D W, Agnes Ellis and David Whitmore. "Your mother survived hard things so you could survive harder ones," Rowan said. "Choose well, Miss Calloway." She did not correct the name. It felt right. Rowan mounted his horse and rode west toward the mountains. He did not look back. Cole watched from the corral, one hand raised in silent farewell. 6 weeks later, on a clear Sunday afternoon, they stood before the small church in Dusthaven. The ceremony was simple. The preacher, the brothers, Martha Hensley, Sheriff Beckett, and a handful of townspeople who had come to know and respect the woman who survived the river. Elise wore a white dress that Martha had sewn by hand, trimmed with lace from Margaret's sewing basket found in the room that was no longer locked. The silver locket hung at her throat, her mother's wedding ring on her right hand. Silas wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers. His hat was off for the first time anyone could remember. His chestnut hair, streaked with gray, was combed neatly. His hands trembled when he took hers at the altar. The same hands that had mended fences, fired rifles, carved a headstone in bitter cold, and held a dying woman's fingers as she slipped away. Now they trembled because they were holding something they were afraid of losing. When the preacher asked him to speak his vows, Silas said only this: "I do not promise an easy life, I promise an honest one. I promise these hands will build, not break. This heart will hold, not abandon. And this home will always be yours no matter what comes." The seasons turned. The first winter was the hardest. Snow fell 3 feet deep. The passes closed. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. Silas rose at 4 every morning to break ice in the water troughs with an axe, each blow ringing through the darkness like a blacksmith's hammer. The cattle had to be driven into shelter every night and released every morning, a task that required all three brothers working in shifts, while Elise kept the house warm and the meals coming. She learned to keep the fire burning through the night, banking it with oak logs that held heat for hours, arranging the damper on the stove so the draft was just right. Not so much that the wood burned too fast, not so little that the flame suffocated. She learned to melt snow for water when the creek froze solid, to stretch provisions, to make soup from bones and dried beans that tasted like warmth itself. She learned that on the frontier, winter was not a season. It was an opponent, and you either outworked it or it buried you. The world shrank to the size of their cabin, and inside that small, warm space, they learned each other the way you learn a language, slowly and then all at once. The way Silas always placed his boots by the door, with the toes pointing out ready to step into. The way Elise hummed while she kneaded bread, the same hymn her mother sang, the same hymn that Margaret sang, connecting three women across time and distance through melody. The way he liked his coffee. The way she folded blankets, hospital corners, a habit from years of making beds in someone else's house. Small things. But small things are what a life is built from. One night when the cold was so severe that the walls groaned and the window glass frosted thick as paper, Elise reached for Silas in the dark and said, "Stay." And he stayed sitting in the chair beside the bed all night, feeding the small iron stove, keeping the fire alive. When she woke at dawn, he was still there, slumped sideways in the chair, with the fire poker in his hand, asleep. She draped a blanket over his shoulders and went to make coffee. His cup was waiting on the table, hot and black, when he opened his eyes. Spring came like a resurrection. Snow melting, grass returning, calves born in the pasture wobbly and loud. Cole named the first one River. Elise laughed and swatted his shoulder. The second year brought their first child, a girl born during a January blizzard while the doctor was snowed in 20 miles away. Martha rode through the storm to help. Silas stayed in the room, his calloused hands steadier than they had any right to be, and when the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, he wept. Not quietly, not decorously. He wept the way a man weeps when a dam breaks after being sealed for years. The baby was so small, she fit in one of his palms. They named her Margaret Agnes Calloway. Two sisters reunited in a single name. The 5th year, Cole married Martha Hensley. The ceremony was held outdoors beside the river at the exact spot where Cole had pulled Elise from the water. When the preacher asked Cole to take Martha as his wife, he was silent for so long that people began to worry. Then he spoke, his voice unsteady in a way none of them had ever heard. "All my life, I have only known how to destroy things, how to shoot, how to fight, how to run. This woman taught me how to build. I take her not because I deserve her, but because she makes me want to become deserving." Martha cried. Wyatt blew his nose so loudly that the entire congregation turned to look. By the 10th year, 2 more children had come. Boys. The ranch had doubled in size. Wyatt married a school teacher named Lenora Pruitt, the only woman alive who could make him laugh out loud. At the dedication of Dusthaven's first schoolhouse, built by Lenore's determination in the community's labor, Silas was asked to speak. He stood before the crowd, turning his hat in his hands, and said one sentence. "My first wife was a teacher. She believed books could change the world. I was not sure she was right, but she changed me, so perhaps she was." He sat down. The room was silent. Then applause. Elise took his hand under the bench, and he held it the way a man holds a rope in a storm. 30 years. 30 years since the day Elise Whitmore stepped off a stagecoach into nothing. Silas was 65 now, 55, slower, his back slightly bowed, his hair white as mountain snow, but his calloused hands were still strong, his amber eyes still sharp, and he still rose before dawn every morning to drink coffee on the porch and watch the valley wake. It was the same coffee brewed the same way in the same tin pot on the same iron stove. Some things change. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. Elise was 53. Her honey blonde hair was threaded with silver. The soft hands that once belonged to a girl from Boston were calloused now strong from 30 years of kneading bread and mending fences and holding children and stroking her husband's face through 10,000 nights. She still wore the silver locket at her throat, worn smooth by 3 decades of touch. The photograph inside faded to almost nothing but the faces of the two sisters still visible if you held it to the light. Cole and Martha had their own ranch next door built on the land Martha had been managing since her first husband died. 4 children, 6 grandchildren. Cole was 57 now, still carrying his guns on his hips out of habit rather than necessity. The fiercest battles he fought these days were arguments with grandchildren about the proper way to saddle a horse and whether biscuits should be eaten with honey or molasses. Martha always won the biscuit argument. Cole always pretended to be outraged. The grandchildren always laughed. Wyatt had become the county's justice of the peace, a position that suited him perfectly. The man who once read people the way trackers read hoofprints now read the law with the same precision, dispensing justice with a fairness that earned him respect across the territory. Lenore's school had grown into the finest in Montana. Their children could all read before they could write a fact Wyatt considered his single greatest achievement, greater than any cattle drive or financial calculation, or the time he talked a shotgun guard into lowering his weapon, using nothing but a calm voice and a convincing story. On the hill behind the ranch house, 3 graves lay beneath a cottonwood tree that had grown 3 times its original size. Margaret, Agnes, and a small unnamed stone for the baby who never drew breath. Every spring, Elise and Silas brought wildflowers to the graves. Indian paintbrush and wild columbine, the last flowers of the season, their colors vivid against the weathered stone. They stood there in silence, hand in hand, remembering the ones they lost and the ones they found. Every year on the anniversary of Margaret's death, Silas climbed the hill alone. He sat beside the headstone he had carved with bleeding fingers 37 years ago, removed his hat, and spoke quietly. He told Margaret about the ranch, about the children, about Elise. "You would have loved her," he said every time. "You would have loved your niece." Then he placed a single wild flower on the stone, stood slowly feeling the years in his knees, and walked back down the hill toward the sound of his family laughing in the yard below. Elise knew about this ritual. She never asked what he said on the hill. She did not need to know. She understood that a first love does not disappear when a second love arrives. It simply finds a quieter place in the heart, still warm, still honored. Margaret was not her rival. Margaret was the woman who had saved the Calloway brothers from darkness and by doing so had created the home that Elise eventually found. She owed Margaret more than she owed anyone living. One autumn, when their son Ephraim brought home a young woman from Helena and announced that he intended to marry her, Silas watched his boy standing beside the woman he loved, tall and quiet, and amber eyes just like his father's, and felt a circle closing. Ephraim looked at that girl the same way Silas had once looked at Margaret, the same way he looked at Elise, the same expression of wonder and quiet terror that comes with loving someone so much that losing them would break you. "He is so much like you," Elise whispered to Silas that evening as they sat on the porch watching Ephraim and his bride walking together along the creek in the fading light. Silas thought for a moment. "I hope not in the bad parts." "The bad parts are the reason the good parts matter," Elise said. "No one appreciates peace more than someone who has lived through war." Silas looked at her, 53 years old, silver in her hair, eyes still blue as cornflowers, the same blue they had been the day she stepped off a stagecoach into nothing. And for the 10,000th time, he wondered what he had done to deserve this woman. And for the 10,000th time, he found no answer. But he had stopped asking. Some things do not require reasons. They only require keeping. The final scene took place on a clear autumn evening, the last warm evening before winter claimed the valley. Elise stood on the ridge behind the ranch house between the gravestones, wildflowers in her hand. Below the valley stretched out in gold and green, the cattle moving slowly through the pasture, the Bitterroot River shining silver in the fading light. The sound of grandchildren playing in the yard floated up the hill. Laughter, small feet on packed earth. Cole's voice shouting something about the fence. Wyatt shaking his head. Silas came up the hill. He moved quietly for a man his size, a habit from decades of working around skittish horses and sleeping cattle. He stood beside her, hat in his hands, white hair stirring in the evening breeze. I still remember the day I stepped off that stagecoach, Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper. Standing alone on that dusty street, holding a letter from a man who lied. No one came to meet me. I thought my life was over. Silas looked at her, at this woman who had arrived in his valley half dead and terrified, and had built with him everything he could see below. The house, the ranch, the family, the life. Your life was just beginning, he said. You just did not know it yet. From below, Martha's voice called them to supper. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread carried on the wind, the same smells that had filled this valley for 30 years, the smells of a home that had been built from nothing by people who had been given nothing. Grandchildren raced for the door, colliding in the frame, shouting over each other, ignoring Cole's bellowed instructions with the cheerful defiance that only grandchildren possess. Wyatt stood on the porch, shaking his head, a tin coffee cup in one hand, his wife's hand in the other. Laughter filled the house. Every room, every corner. Laughter that reached all the way up the hill to where Silas and Elise stood among the graves of the women who had made this life possible. Silas offered his arm, a small gesture, old-fashioned, formal, but from Silas Calloway, a man who had not voluntarily touched another human being for 7 years before she arrived, it was everything. Elise took his arm. They walked down the hill together toward the lighted windows, toward the laughter and the smell of supper, toward the family that was waiting for them. The silver locket gleamed at her throat, worn smooth by 30 years warm from her skin, holding inside it a small photograph of two sisters smiling, two women who had searched for each other across distance and time and cruelty and death, and found each other at last through the daughter who stood between their graves. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing. 30 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through wildflower, she thought that was the day my life began. And in that vast, untamed land where pain and redemption walk side by side, the story of Elise Calloway, born Whitmore, claimed by the river, raised by brothers, became a whispered legend across the Montana frontier. The tale of the mail-order bride who fell into the river and rose again to find her family and claim her freedom beneath the endless western sky.